Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and it's a great opportunity for me to talk a little bit about our work. I have prepared some slides, and the reason I've done that is because I don't think that we can discuss migration and have migration policies without knowing the facts. So what I would like to do here in the 7 minutes I have, or 6 minutes and 40 seconds, is to provide you some facts which may be quite useful for this discussion. Now, when we talk about migration and poverty, there are, of course, various aspects of it, and I will just focus on some of them. Well, one big question is, does poverty cause migration? Does economic disadvantage cause migration? Secondly, does migration cause poverty? And that could be in the native population, but it could also be among immigrants. And, well, I just want to provide some numbers on these issues. So, of course, the larger the economic differences between countries, the larger is the willingness or the intention of people to move from disadvantaged places to advantaged places. One very important aspect, of course, in that discussion is that many people are simply too poor to even afford migration. So the migrants we are seeing coming from developing countries, in particular to Europe, are individuals who actually can afford to emigrate. But then economic disadvantage is not the main reason for people to change location. We have looked at well, data for about 80, 90 countries and try to structure what are the main considerations for people to move their place of nativity and move to other countries. And one thing which is quite striking, looking at Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, is that it is not so much well, wealth factors, economic disadvantage, but it is concern about security and local services, and in particular about security. People don't have water, they don't have a future for their children, they don't have institutions which they think are meaningful to afford them to stay where they are. So if we want to address the issue of emigration, this is certainly what we should focus on. Now, well, let me not talk about that. So one important question, of course, when we now start to structure our migration policies, or for many countries that means in Europe, talk the first time about migration policies, is trying to understand what actually is the situation of the current population of immigrants in European countries. And if we do that, the picture is pretty bleak. So what I have given you here are some slides on how immigrants are actually faring at the moment economically in European countries. This year is the employment differential between immigrants and natives across different European countries. And what you can see is that in every European country, with very few exceptions, immigrants actually have a much lower probability to engage in employment and in the labor market. They are also much more likely to be at the low end of the earnings distribution. So this is where immigrants are focused in, where they are concentrated in the earnings distribution. And what you can see is they are predominantly at the low end of the earnings distribution. Now, very important, of course, when we talk about migration are the children of immigrants. Where are the children of immigrants in the distribution of earnings? Are they in mainly poor households, or are they in richer households? Well, here the picture is even bleaker. So if we look at households where both partners are in the lowest 10% of the earnings distribution, then in countries Belgium, France, Germany, and Italy, this amounts to about 3% of all households. If we look at immigrant households, if we look at households where both partners are in the lowest decile of the earnings distribution and who have children below 15, then this amounts to 2.5% of households. However, when we look at the immigrant population where both partners are in the lowest 10% of the earnings distribution, and we look at we look at the percentage of children who are growing up in households at the lowest 10% of the earnings distribution for both partners, then for non-EU immigrants it is actually 1 in 5, which is a dramatic number. Well, let me just spend the last 3 minutes on refugee migration. Well, we all know we had very large illegal crossings into Europe. This is just data from Frontex, 1.8 million alone in 2015, and 2016 is likely to be slightly lower, but still very substantial compared to the average over the last decade. Well, people come mainly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. We know that very well, and there is a lot of speculation how this creates economic challenges for European countries. Now, one very interesting aspect, of course, is we already have large refugee populations in European countries. So let me just conclude by pointing out a little bit where and how those refugee populations are actually doing economically in Europe. And perhaps we can learn something from that for how we should structure future policies. So this is simply comparing, and I do that for the example of the UK. So the small dot up there is the employment differential between natives and immigrants in a country like, for instance, the UK. The dot with this large, what we call confidence interval, is the same for refugee migrants. And we can do that for different European countries, and what you see in those figures is compared to non-European migrants, migrants who arrived in each of these European countries as refugees are doing economically far worse. We can now ask the question, where do these refugees are coming from? And can we learn something about those past figures for how we should address future challenges? Well, I have done that in this particular table. These are different origins of refugee and non-refugee immigrants in different European countries. And the figure I would want to point out is basically this one. So refugee immigrants from Northern Africa and the Middle East are given in the second row, have an employment disadvantage of about 32%. That compares to economic immigrants from the same area who have an employment disadvantage of about 18%. Now, that is quite dramatic, and I would think very concerning, because these are precisely refugees we are challenged to integrate into our economies at the moment. And I think we need to be a little bit more proactive in doing that compared how we did that in the past. So let me just conclude, not having much time to talk about this very complex and wide issue. Immigration can be of great advantage for Europe. Of course, it has to be managed well. It is very important, in my view, to have very clear immigration policies that are well understood and also accepted by native populations. If we don't do that, we give rise to populist parties to intervene in this debate, and we have all seen to what that may lead. These need to consider not just the short-term economic aspects, but, and I have given you some examples of the long-term economic consequences of policies which don't take that very much into account, but the long-term necessities of economic and social integration. Thank you very much.